He said nothing to anybody. He did not put in another request. That is the part that tells you what kind of man he was. He made a decision, and then he spent the 8th of March preparing in the open, in front of everyone, and nobody thought anything of it, because it looked exactly like a scout getting ready for a patrol. Rations for 2 days, 2 canteens taped so they would not knock. He left his rifle behind, which nobody noticed, and took a trench knife and a captured Luger he did not intend to use and never did. He blackened his buckles with soot. He copied 5 positions out of his notebook onto a piece of map, with grid squares, timings, relief schedules, and in 2 cases, the men's habits. He wrote no letter. His mother had died in 1941, his brothers were scattered, and he was not the sort to compose anything for posterity. At 2 o'clock in the morning, on the 9th of March, 1944, Warren Teague went through the wire in front of C Company, told the sentry he was clearing a listening post, and did not come back for 19 hours. The first position was the pumping station, the one that had probably killed Dunbar. A low concrete building with a collapsed roof beside an irrigation channel, 400 yards out from the American wire, one observer inside working a 12-hour shift, relieved at 8 in the morning and 8 at night. Teague did not go straight at it. He went out at an angle, 300 yards east. Into the drainage ditch he had already established was clear because the German reliefs used it, and then he came back west, down that ditch, with the water going over the small of his back and into his sleeves. The ice broke against his forearms in sheets, thin as window pane. He moved on his elbows. He gave himself 2 hours to cover 200 yards, and he took all of it. At 5:04 in the morning, he stopped, because the sky behind him had begun to go gray, and he was in the last 100 yards. And the last 100 yards was the part where you could not fix a mistake. He lay there for 2 hours and 40 minutes and watched the man in the pumping station drink coffee and sweep the line and write in a log every 20 minutes or so. He could see one hand, part of a shoulder, and the 2 dark circles of the objective lenses when the light caught them. He waited for the relief, because the 8 o'clock changeover was the only moment in that observer's entire day when he would look away from the front for longer than a breath. At 7:51, the relief came up the ditch on the far side, moving without much care because they had done it 80 times. And for about 4 minutes, 2 Germans stood in the wrecked doorway of a pumping station with their backs to no man's land, passing over binoculars and a clipboard and a thermos and talking about whatever men talk about at the end of a shift. And in the middle of those 4 minutes, a man came out of an irrigation ditch behind them, crossed 40 feet of open concrete, and was inside the building before either of them turned around. It was over in under 10 seconds, and neither of them made enough noise to carry 20 yards. Teague dragged both bodies down into the pump housing, where the water had been, and pulled a piece of corrugated roof over the opening. Then, he did something that was not in his report, something he had thought of 2 nights earlier in the trench, listening to Dunbar. He did not destroy the equipment. He took the field telephone, and he traced the cable, and he cut it in a place 40 yards from the position, in a ditch, underwater, where a break looked exactly like the 100 other breaks that shell fire caused every day on that beachhead. Then he went back and he took the logbook and the binoculars and both paybooks, and he put them in his pack. He wanted the Germans to think the line was down. A dead observer is an alarm. A dead telephone is a Tuesday. The second position was 1,100 yards northwest, in a stone sheepfold on a low-rise, 2 men, and it took him 5 hours. There was no ditch, no cover of any kind for the last 300 yards except the rise itself and a scatter of broken stone where a wall had come down. Full daylight by then, a clear, cold morning with the kind of light that makes distance meaningless. And 2 of them, which meant at any given moment at least 1 pair of eyes, was working. So Teague did the thing that separates him from everybody else who ever tried something like this, which is that he did not go. He lay in a shallow scrape 400 yards out for 3 hours and built their pattern in his head the way he had built the trot line in the dark, and when he had it, he moved on the pattern and not on his nerve. The Southern man swept the American line in a fixed arc that averaged 51 seconds. The Northern man had the radio and the log and worked head down in bursts of 15 to 40 seconds. About every 10 minutes, they spoke, and when they spoke, they looked at each other. Teague moved 11 times. The longest move was 19 yards, the shortest 4. Between moves, he lay entirely still on ground, so open that a man standing where he lay could have been seen from the Alban Hills. Twice, an American mortar section a mile back dropped registration rounds on nothing in particular, and both Germans turned to watch the fall of shot, and Teague took 30 yards out of the first and 22 out of the second. He said later that whoever those mortarmen were, they never knew they were the most useful men in Italy that morning. At 2:14 in the afternoon, he came over the low wall behind the Northern man, while the Southern man was in the 41st second of a 51-second sweep. He cut that telephone line too, in a shell hole, under mud. The third position was a single observer in the upper corner of a farmhouse that had lost its front wall, and Teague did not reach it until after dark, and it was nearly the end of him. He came in from the north, through a vineyard where shelling had snapped the trellis wires so they hung at knee height, invisible. He was moving on a cigarette pattern, going when the ember brightened and stopping when it dimmed. He was 70 yards out when 5 German infantry came down the farm track and stopped, and one of them sat on the wall 8 feet from where Teague lay under a collapsed section of trellis with his face in the dirt and a length of rusted wire across the back of his neck. They were there for 26 minutes. The man on the wall took his boot off and rubbed his foot. Teague did not move at all. At one point, somebody urinated close enough that Teague could feel the warmth of it soaking toward him through the ground. Then they went on down the track, and Teague waited another 20 minutes for his hands to stop, because he had learned as a boy that a man who moves while he is still shaking makes noise. And then he got up and finished it. And the observer in the farmhouse never knew he had ever been in danger. The fourth position was a cistern under the floor of a wayside chapel, and it was the last one, and it is the one everything afterward turned on. The chapel had been shelled down to about waist height on 3 sides. Underneath it was a stone-lined cistern, dry, with a hatch that had been widened, and inside it, a single observer with a periscope made out of a length of pipe and a mirror and a radio and an oil lamp turned down to nothing. Teague got to the hatch at 10 minutes past 9 at night, having taken 4 hours to cross 800 yards, and he looked down and saw a man of about 40 asleep sitting up, with the periscope resting against his shoulder and a piece of paper in his hand. He killed him. Let us not soften that. He had been awake for 39 hours, and he had 4 dead men behind him and 1 more in front of him, and he did what he had come to do. But afterward, he sat down on the cistern steps in the dark with the lamp turned up, and he looked at the paper, and it was a half-finished letter, and clipped to it with a bent pin was a photograph of a girl of 8 or 9 years old standing in front of a garden gate with a dog whose head was blurred because it had moved. Teague could not read German. He took the letter anyway, and the photograph, and the paybook, which gave the man's name as Ernst Polig, and he put them in his pack with the other 4, and then he cut the aerial lead on the radio inside the insulation where it would look like a fault. He came back through the American wire at 10 minutes to 9 on the morning of the 10th of March, 21 hours after he had gone out, and the sentry very nearly shot him because he was black to the wrists with mud and blood, and did not answer the challenge the first time. Hoyt was waiting at the company command post. Teague put his pack on the table and took out 5 paybooks and laid them in a row. Then the logbook. Then the binoculars. Then he took the carbon copy of the memorandum out of his breast pocket, unfolded it, and set it down beside the paybooks, because he wanted it understood that he had known exactly what he was doing. He said, "Sir, I have disobeyed that." Hoyt looked at the row of paybooks for a long time. Then he said, "Sit down before you fall down," and Teague sat down on the dirt floor and did not get up for a while. Hoyt placed him under arrest. He had no choice, and Teague had not expected anything else. He confined him to the company area, took his weapons, and filed a report to battalion the same morning, recommending court-martial for willful disobedience of a lawful order. He also, in the same report, in the same paragraph, in a sentence that was later read aloud at 5th Army headquarters, wrote that the sergeant had in 19 hours accomplished what the entire divisional artillery had failed to accomplish in 7 weeks. Nothing happened for 2 days. Then the German fire on the 157th sector went stupid, not silent. That was the part nobody expected, and it is the part that made the method worth more than the crime. The batteries kept firing, the same volume, the same schedule, but they were firing on pre-registered coordinates, on ground where somebody had seen Americans 2 days earlier, and the corrections stopped coming, because there was nobody left to correct them. A ration party walked 800 yards in daylight on the 11th of March and drew nothing. A company shifted position in the open at 4 in the afternoon on the 12th, and the nearest shells came down 300 yards behind them in an empty field and stayed there. An artillery liaison officer named Dowd, who had kept counter-battery records since January because it was his job, worked out that the fire falling on that sector had gone from about 70% effective, meaning landing within 200 yards of an actual target, to under 9. And because Teague had cut wires instead of smashing radios, the Germans spent 4 days believing they had a signals problem. They sent repair parties down the lines, they found breaks in shell holes, which is what everybody finds in a shell hole. 2 of those parties did not come back either, because by then, the method was no longer only Teague's. On the 14th of March, Teague was taken under guard to 5th Army Rear Headquarters at Caserta, which he assumed was where they held courts-martial, and was instead put in a room with 3 staff officers and a stenographer, and told to explain in his own words how he had done it. It took 11 hours over 2 days. At one point, a full colonel asked him how a man could possibly know when to move, and Teague said, "Sir, you don't know, you find out." The colonel asked him to explain the difference. Teague said that knowing was what you did before you went, and finding out was what you did while you were lying there, and that the men who died were the ones who tried to do all their knowing in advance. They did not court-martial him. They did something stranger. They suspended the charge, promoted nobody, praised nobody, and attached him to a provisional training detachment with orders to instruct. He got 12 men, and they were not who you would guess. One sniper, who turned out to be the worst of the lot, because a sniper's whole training is to find one good position and stay in it. One night orderly from a hospital who could walk a ward of sleeping men without waking any of them. And a private first class named Aurelio Sandoval from Silver City, New Mexico, who had climbed telephone poles at night for 4 years and could do things with a length of wire that made the signals officers uncomfortable. Teague taught badly at first. He would say things like, "You'll feel it," and the men would look at each other. Hoyt fixed that, and it is worth stopping on the fact that the officer who banned the method ended up drilling it, because there is a version of this story where Hoyt is the villain, and that version is a lie. He made Teague break it into pieces small enough to test, and built exercises for each one with divisional personnel acting as observers, and scored the results like he was grading geometry papers. The first week, all 12 got caught. By the 4th, they were getting through 8 times out of 10 against Americans who knew they were coming. Sandoval added the piece Teague had only half invented. Instead of cutting a line, he could tap it and splice it and put it back so that it still worked. Over 6 weeks in April and May, German batteries in front of the beachhead received fire corrections in correct procedure and correct format from observation posts whose personnel were already dead, and put a considerable weight of shell onto ground where there was nothing but wet grass and one very cold man from New Mexico lying 200 yards off with a set of headphones. By the breakout on the 23rd of May, there were 4 of these detachments working out of Anzio, and when the war moved north, they went with it. Teague ran the training until December of 1944, when a fragment from an airburst near Ribeauville went through his left knee and put him in a hospital in Nancy for 11 weeks and out of the war. He never got a medal for the 9th of March, not one. The recommendation Hoyt eventually wrote came back with a note saying that the action could not be recognized because the conduct in question was the subject of a suspended disciplinary charge, and that the charge could not be dismissed because dismissing it would establish that the order had been improper. The Army solved the problem by writing the method into a training circular in early 1945, under a heading about close reconnaissance of enemy observation posts, in flat institutional language, with the timings and the sweep intervals and the sound masking guidance all present and correct, and with no name attached to any of it. There is a copy in the National Archives. It is 4.5 pages long. It reads like it was written by a committee, and it was, and every idea in it belonged to a poacher's son from Charlton County, Georgia. That is the thing about the paper a war leaves behind. It records what units did, and almost never what men did. If a name in your family has gone quiet like that, a photograph nobody can place, a box of objects that came home and never got explained, I wrote a guide for exactly that. It is called Find Your Grandfather's War, and it is in the description. Almost everything a serviceman did is written down somewhere. The hard part is knowing which door to knock on. Warren Teague was discharged in July of 1945, with a stiff left leg, a small pension, and the rank of staff sergeant. He went back to Folkestone and worked for the County Road Department for 31 years, mostly on a grader. He married a woman named Alma Register in 1947, and they had 2 sons and a daughter. And he did not tell any of them anything. Not a story. Not once. His daughter, Ruth, said the only time she ever heard her father mention the war was when a neighbor's boy asked him if he had killed anybody. And Teague said, yes. And the boy asked, how many? And Teague said, more than I'd like and fewer than you're thinking, and then went out and worked on the truck for 2 hours. He kept a wooden ammunition box on the top shelf of the closet in the back bedroom. The children were not forbidden to open it. Exactly. It was simply understood. He died in Waycross on the 6th of June, 1989, age 68. In the same week, everybody on television was talking about Normandy, which he had not been at and never claimed to be at. 51 people came to the funeral. One was a man in his 70s, who flew in from Albuquerque, stood at the back, and did not speak to the family until afterward. When he shook Ruth's hand and said only that her father had taught him something in Italy that he had used for 11 months and come home because of. She never got his name. The box came down off the shelf that August. Inside were 5 German paybooks, a pair of Zeiss binoculars with a chip out of one lens, an observation log in a language nobody in the family could read, a carbon copy of a typed memorandum dated 3rd March 1944, gone soft, at the folds, and an unfinished letter with a photograph pinned to it of a girl of about 8 in front of a garden gate with a blurred dog. Ruth had the letter translated in 1994. 3 paragraphs, from a man named Ernst Polig to his daughter Liesel, mostly about a bicycle he was going to fix when he got home, breaking off in the middle of a sentence. Her father had carried that photograph for 45 years and never once mentioned it. The rest got assembled by other people, the way these things always do. A graduate student named Maren Kessler, working in the military archive at Freiburg in 2011, found a fire mission ledger kept by a Hauptmann Dietrich Solter of an observation battalion at Anzio, and noticed that the neat daily columns stopped on the 9th of March, 1944, and resumed 4 days later in a different hand with a marginal note complaining about cable faults. She followed the cable faults. They took her to a 60-page transcript from Caserta and to a sergeant whose answers she called the most lucid account of infiltration she had ever read, and who spoke, she wrote, like a man explaining how to fish. There is no monument, there is no plaque in Folkestone. There is a grader in a county yard that a man drove for 31 years, a training circular with nobody's name on it, and 5 paybooks in a box. And the thing I keep coming back to is not the killing, because the killing is the least interesting part of Warren Teague, and he clearly thought so too. It is that he was told no by a good officer for good reasons, and he thought about it, and he decided the good reasons were wrong, and he did it anyway. And he carried the order in his pocket while he did it, so that nobody would have to wonder whether he had understood. Armies cannot run on that. If every sergeant decided which orders were correct, you would not have an army, you would have a mob with rifles. Hoyt was not wrong to ban it. He was protecting men, he had a dead scout to prove his point, and he would have been right 9 times out of 10. This was the 10th time, and the only way anyone ever finds out which time it is afterward. If this one got to you, hit like, because it does genuinely help these stories reach people who would never hear them otherwise. Subscribe if you want more of them, and tell me in the comments where you are watching from, and whether there is a man in your family whose war nobody ever asked about. Thank you for keeping these stories alive. At 4 minutes past 5 on the morning of March 9th, 1944, a sergeant from the swamp country of South Georgia lay face down in an irrigation ditch outside Aprilia, Italy, in 11 inches of water that had a skin of ice on it. He had been in that ditch for 2 hours and 40 minutes. He had not moved his head in 40 of them. 210 yards in front of him, in the shell of a pumping station, a German artillery observer was drinking coffee out of a tin cup and watching the American lines through a pair of Zeiss binoculars worth more than the sergeant's entire yearly pay before the war. By 9 o'clock that night, that observer would be dead. So would 4 others, spread across 1.5 miles of ground that every field manual in the United States Army described as impassable to a single man in daylight. Not one shot would be fired. Not one radio would go silent in a way the Germans could explain. And the man who did it would be doing it in direct violation of a written order. Not a suggestion, not a raised eyebrow from a nervous officer. An actual typed memorandum, initialed and filed, that named his method and forbade him from using it ever again. His name was Warren Teague. He was 23 years old, and before we get to what he did in that ditch, you need to understand where he learned to lie still. Warren Teague was born in Folkestone, Charlton County, Georgia, 3 miles from the eastern edge of the Okefenokee Swamp, in a house his grandfather had built out of heart pine that never quite stopped sweating resin in the summer. His father, Elias, was a market hunter in a decade when market hunting had stopped being a trade and started being a crime. Georgia had game wardens now, and so did the federal government, and Elias Teague fed 5 children on deer and gator hide and shipped duck in violation of about 9 different statutes, which meant that from the age of 6, Warren's education was not really in hunting. It was in not being seen by men who were specifically looking for him. That is a different skill. Hiding from an animal is easy, because an animal is looking for movement and smell and nothing else. Hiding from a man is hard, because a man is looking for you on purpose, and a man has a theory about where you are. Elias taught his son that a warden's attention was a thing with a shape. It had a direction and a duration. It went where the warden expected trouble, and it stayed there a while, and then it went somewhere else, and when it went somewhere else, it left a hole behind it, and the hole was where you walked. He also taught him not to cross open ground, ever, in the pine flats behind their place, where the sun came down in bars between the trunks. Elias would put a hand on the back of his son's neck and point and say, "Don't cut the light. Link the shadows. Go from one to the next like you're stringing hooks on a line. It takes 4 times as long, and nobody ever finds you." Warren was 11 the first time a warden's flashlight passed over the log he was lying behind, close enough that he could count the eyelets on the man's boots. He did not run. He had already worked out that the warden was sweeping the bank in a rhythm, left to right, pausing at the cypress knees, and that there was a beat in that rhythm where the light and the man's face were both turned away. He waited 9 sweeps. Then he took the hole and was gone. By 15, he could take a boat out at 3 in the morning, work a stretch of water with 2 wardens actively hunting him, and be home before his mother started the stove. He was not brave about it. He was patient about it, which is a different thing and much rarer. Then, in 1937, his father was shot through the hip by a warden's deputy on the Suwannee Canal and lived 11 days and died in the front room. Warren was 16. He worked a turpentine camp and then a sawmill. And in November of 1942, he walked into a recruiting office in Waycross and enlisted, mostly because the mill was cutting shifts, and the Army paid every month. The Army saw no education past the 8th grade and put him in the infantry. What got him noticed was a night compass problem at Camp Barkley. 4 checkpoints across 2 miles of scrub, no lights, Back before dawn, half the men got lost. Teague came in 41 minutes ahead of the next man, and when the lieutenant asked him how, he said he had followed the sound of the highway and the smell of the creek and counted his own steps. The lieutenant wrote in his file that the recruit had unusual night orientation. That sentence changed his life. They made him a scout. He went ashore at Sicily with the 45th Infantry Division, fought up through Salerno in the fall, and in January of 1944, he was loaded onto an LST at Naples with the rest of the 157th Infantry Regiment and put ashore on a strip of Italian coastline that would nearly kill all of them. Anzio was supposed to be the clever move. Come in behind the German line at Cassino, cut Highway 7, threaten Rome, force the whole southern front to fall back. Instead, the beachhead stalled. Within 3 weeks, the Allies had 70,000 men on a piece of ground 15 miles wide and 7 miles deep, and the Germans had every gun they could find on the high ground of the Alban Hills, looking straight down into it. There was no rear at Anzio. That is the part people never understand about it. In a normal front, you go up to the line, and then you come back and you sleep. At Anzio, there was nowhere to come back to. Field hospitals took direct hits. Men were killed standing in line for chow 4 miles from the nearest German. Even the water where the supply ships anchored was under observed fire. But the guns were not, by themselves, the problem. A gun is blind. A gun is a piece of steel that throws metal at a map coordinate. What made the German artillery at Anzio into something close to a murder machine was the men with the binoculars. By February of 1944, the German observation service was laid out across the beachhead in a lattice. 2-man teams, sometimes a single man, working out of drainage culverts and haystacks and the second floors of blown-out farmhouses, and, in one case, a trench dug under the floor of a chicken coop. Field telephones wired back through buried cable. Radios for when the cable was cut. Most of them were not infantry at all. They were artillerymen, technically trained, with good optics and better maps, and their job was to sit perfectly still for 12 hours and report. Here's the arithmetic that killed Americans at Anzio. An observer sees movement. He estimates the grid square, which he can do in about 8 seconds, because he has been staring at the same terrain for a week and has it memorized in squares. He passes it. The battery lays the guns, which takes under a minute for a crew that has been sitting on that firing data all morning. First rounds land somewhere between 80 and 110 seconds after the observer opened his mouth. 90 seconds. That was the interval between an American platoon leader deciding to move his men and the arrival of the first shell. And it was not blind fire, because the same observer was watching the fall of shot and walking the correction in. Left 50, drop 100, fire for effect. On February 19th, a rifle company from the 157th tried to shift 2 platoons across 400 yards of open field near the Padiglione Woods. They did everything right. Dispersed, using a fold in the ground, moving at last light. Somebody was watching anyway. The first salvo came in before the lead squad had cleared 150 yards, and it did not fall short and it did not fall long. Teague was 200 yards east on the flank with a field telephone, and what he watched was 31 men going down in 4 minutes. Among them was Private Elmer Sykes of Ord, Nebraska, who narrated everything he did in a low mutter, like he was reading his own instruction manual, and Corporal Nathan Braddock of Rumford, Maine, who had spent one entire night crossing the Atlantic explaining to Teague the correct way to grade lumber. Teague put in his first request 3 days later. He wanted to go out and find the observers and kill them. His company commander was a captain named Russell Hoyt, 34, from Zanesville, Ohio, who before the war had taught high school geometry and coached a very bad baseball team. He was not a West Point man, and he was not a fool. And he had the particular tiredness officers get when they have written more letters to mothers than they can remember. He turned Teague down flat, and he did it because of a man named Whit Beals. Beals had been a scout in the same company, a quiet kid from Coeur d'Alene who had come up through a sniper course and shot the best group in his class. In late January, he went after an observation post in a stone farmhouse near the Fossa di Carcero, and he did it by the book. In position at 3 in the morning, hide built in a rubble pile at 400 yards, one round through the observer's chest at 20 past 7. That part worked. The observer went down and stayed down. What Beals had no way of knowing was that the German teams were doubled and staggered on purpose, precisely so that a sniper attacking one would reveal himself to the other. The second man was 30 yards away in a cistern with a field telephone. He never even looked for the muzzle flash. He called the grid square the shot had come out of. 8 mortar rounds arrived inside 40 seconds, and the second one killed Whit Beals. Hoyt wrote that letter, and he decided, in the private way officers decide things, that he was not going to lose another scout to a clever idea. So he told Teague, "No, kindly," and explained the arithmetic of the doubled positions, and said his job was to see, report, and come back, and that the third part was the part the Army actually cared about. Teague said, "Yes, sir." Then he went out on patrol that night and started working the problem anyway. He did not, at first, do anything he had been forbidden to do, because he had not yet been forbidden to do anything specific. He was a scout. Scouts went out. What he changed was what he did once he was out there. Instead of moving to a vantage point and observing the German line, Teague began observing the German observers. Not their positions, their attention. He would find a place 300 or 400 yards out, well beyond anything anyone would call risky. And he would lie there for 6 or 7 hours and watch one single man through a pair of captured binoculars, and he would count. How long the sweep took, which direction it started from, how long the man's eyes stayed on the sector where the American positions were thickest, when he set the glasses down, what made him set the glasses down. And what Teague found over about 5 weeks was that the German observation service had a flaw. And the flaw was not laziness. It was the opposite. It was discipline. These men were very good at their jobs. They swept methodically, kept logs, reported on schedule. And because they were methodical, they were predictable, and because they were disciplined, their attention was narrow. A man scanning with 10-power optics has a field of view about the width of a barn door at 400 yards, and while he is inside it, he is blind to everything else, and his peripheral vision, which is the part of the eye that actually catches movement, is looking at nothing but the inside of a lens. That was the hole. Not when they were careless, when they were concentrating. Teague found more holes. The handover of the glasses between 2 men took 4 to 9 seconds, and during it, both of them were looking at the glasses. The log entry took 11 to 20 seconds, and during it, the man was looking at a page. A radio check pulled a man's eyes down to a dial. A cigarette, in the dark, closed a man's night vision for a good half-minute after the ember flared. And he did not know it had, which was better, because a man who does not know he is blind keeps behaving as though he can see. And there was one more, the largest of all. An observer's attention followed the war. If something was happening in front of the American line, every observer in range was looking at it all at once, all in the same direction. A patrol clash a mile away, a truck moving in daylight, a single mortar round dropped on an empty field. For as long as that lasted, the entire lattice was facing one way, and a man could walk almost anywhere he liked behind it. So he started closing the distance, in increments, the way his father had taught him to work a bank, and he kept a notebook. On the 14th of February, he got to 180 yards from a culvert post and watched the relief come up at 9 at night, and learned that they used the same ditch every time, which meant the ditch was clear of mines. On the 26th, he got within 11 yards of a German observer, lay in the lee of a broken wall watching the man's boots, did nothing at all for 90 minutes, and went home. That was the night he understood he could do this whenever he wanted. He came back, and he did the thing that ruined him. He wrote it down. 2 evenings in pencil, 11 pages in a notebook with a cover gone soft as cloth. Timings, diagrams of sweep patterns, a section on wind, and one on how sound carries differently over wet ground. And the phrase he had gotten from his father, which he used because it was the only phrase he had for it, and which is the reason we have a name for any of this at all. A man crossing observed ground, he wrote, should never cut the light. He should link the shadows, moving only in the intervals when enemy attention is committed elsewhere. He called it shadow linking. He handed it to Captain Hoyt on the 2nd of March, 1944, Hoyt read it that night. Then he read it again in the morning. Then he sent a runner for Teague. The conversation happened in a dugout, roofed with a truck bed, and 18 inches of Italian dirt with a kerosene lamp on an ammunition crate, and both men remembered it for the rest of their lives, and they remembered it differently, which is how you know it was real. Hoyt said it was the best piece of tactical writing he had seen since he joined the army. He also said he was going to forbid it. Teague asked why. Hoyt said, "Because you have not written down a method. You have written down a description of the 4 or 5 times it worked for you." Teague said it had worked every time. Hoyt said that was exactly the problem, and then he said the thing Teague was still repeating to himself 40 years later. Every man who ever got killed doing something clever had a run of it working first. That is what makes him try it the 6th time. Then he talked about Beals. He said, "The trouble with a good idea in a war is that you only get to be wrong about it once, and that when Teague was wrong, the company would lose the only scout it had who could find anything. And the men who died in the 2 weeks afterward because nobody knew where the guns were would not know they had died of Teague's cleverness, but they would be just as dead." And Teague, who was not an arguer, said one sentence back. "Sir, if I stay 300 yards out and keep reporting, I can tell you where they are. I have been telling you where they are since January. They are still there." That was true, and both men knew it, and it was the reason neither of them could win the argument. Artillery could not kill the observers because they moved every day or two, and because a man in a culvert is nearly immune to shell fire. Aircraft could not do it because you cannot bomb a single man. Snipers could not do it because of the doubled positions. Patrols in strength could not do it because a patrol in strength is exactly the thing observers exist to see. Hoyt sat there for a while. Then he typed the memorandum himself, on a portable machine, 2 paragraphs, and it went in the company files, and a copy went up to battalion. It stated that the so-called shadow link method described in Sergeant Teague's report of 2nd March was not sanctioned, that scouts of the company were not to approach within 300 yards of any known or suspected enemy observation post, and that reconnaissance personnel were prohibited from initiating close engagement under any circumstances. He handed Teague a carbon copy. He said, "I want you to have that so there is no possibility of a misunderstanding." Teague folded it and put it in his breast pocket, and he kept it there, and it was in that pocket on the 9th of March, wet through and going soft at the folds when he did every single thing it prohibited. What broke it was Cleo Dunbar. Dunbar was a staff sergeant from Amarillo, 31, who before the war had run a radio repair counter in the back of a hardware store and could fix anything in the company that had wire in it. He had spent an evening in February taking apart a captured German field telephone on a blanket in front of Teague, naming each part as he set it down, purely because he liked the objects. He had a wife named Ruby. He was going to open his own shop when he got back and put a sign in the window shaped like a lightning bolt. And he had drawn the sign on the back of an envelope, and he was serious about it. On the 7th of March, Dunbar took a 5-man wire party out at dusk to repair a break in a buried line 600 yards forward of the company positions. Routine work. They were spotted anyway, probably by the post in the pumping station, probably in the last 4 minutes of usable light, and the shells came in 90 seconds later and killed 4 of the 5 outright. Dunbar was not one of the 4. He lived about 2 hours in a shallow depression 60 yards short of the wire, calling for help in a voice that carried perfectly well across open ground, while every man in the forward positions listened and could not go out and get him, because the observer was still up there in the dark and the guns were still laid on that patch of dirt. Teague sat with his back against the wall of a communication trench and listened to Cleo Dunbar die for 2 hours and 11 minutes.